So when we meet the unconditioned, we can't bring anything with us. It's reality just as it is, with nothing added, nothing subtracted. We're not ahead of what's happening, and we're not behind what's happening. There's nothing apart from what's happening. Nothing taking notes. Nothing claiming it. This is not to be taken to mean that there's nothing happening. It's just that what is unconditioned in every way. And ultimately what that means is unconditioned by self, unconditioned by the separate, by the appearance of a separate entity, a doer, a navigator of experience. So in the end, it turns out that all of the conditioning that leads to distortion, leads to suffering, individual suffering, leads to illusion and ignorance, is rooted in the conditioned self and aspects of the conditioned self. The paradox here is that it doesn't even mean that that one has no thoughts of self or I. Thoughts are just thoughts. It's not about that. It's much more fundamental to experiencing this conditioned self-structure. It's woven into all of the processing, the feeling of being on a timeline, the feeling of moving through time, of becoming, the feeling of and perception of struggling against the environment, whether it's subtle or gross. The feeling of existing in a relational matrix with other distinct entities in this relational matrix. That basic assumption is the conditioning that I'm pointing to. The basic assumption that there are objects, that there is form, that boundaries exist. These very fundamental perceptions are the conditioning or the conditioned self that I'm referring to. At this level, what is meant by self and what is meant by world are one and the same. What we perceive as an environment is really just a reflection of all of the conditions that we assume to be the case about ourselves. So we first meet the unconditioned in consciousness. And this was the lecture I gave the first day. When we experience undifferentiated being or unfiltered, unbound being, unbound sense of I, before I becomes anything, just the pure sense of knowing of I. This is a landmark in this unfolding for us. It is a shift into a far freer experience. It's the beginning of the unbinding process itself. And yet identity is still woven into consciousness at this point. Then we come in contact with the unconditioned outside the realm of consciousness, in the actual world, in the physical world, when we're out here. And that's a whole different ball game. It's when the I am experience, or the experience of pure being, is now experienced in all phenomenon. So in a sound, in a form, a shape, or color, that is just as intimate, just as obvious, just as satisfying as the pure sense of I being the center. This is more like center everywhere. But it leads us pretty quickly, unless we struggle against it, I suppose, into the knowing of formlessness. That if the purity of being, the purity of unconditioned knowing exists not only here, but there and there and there, then if we're astute, I guess, energetically, we'll start to question pretty quickly, well, what does here and there even mean anymore? What makes me think there's a here and a there if the intimacy is sort of in every place? If the center is everywhere, what does everywhere even mean anymore? And this is how we are led into an investigation of literally the nature of space, of there being a world at all, an external world. And so now we're coming in contact with unconditioned experience, the most fundamental sense of what experiencing even is, without the split of an experiencer and an experience. It's the purity of experience phenomenon. And it's unconditioned by dimension, unconditioned by spatiality. I don't know if I made that word up, but I've been using it lately. It's unconditioned by identity being something that defines where you are in space, or where anything is in space, much less that it's special. So this is, in a sense, it's like unconditioned space-time. And yet, again, paradoxically, the intimacy of this is increased, or maybe it's not increased, it's undeniable. I would say it becomes deeply satisfying, but not on an emotional spectrum, and not on the spectrum of the seeking eye that wants to find something. It's not like that. It's satisfying in that it's natural, in its naturalness, in its freedom from conditioning. And perhaps in the individual dimension, when I speak of individual from here on out, or me, or the person, it's really in the conventional sense. It's just a way of speaking. But in the personal dimension, one develops a deep trust in instinct. and the instinct arises here. It's not a thought. It's not an evaluation. It's not an emotion. The instinct is that the perceiver of the instinct itself, and what it's arising from is all the same thing. There's far less concern with what to manage outside of this moment, because there's really no outside of this moment. No world, no problems. No world, no struggles. Nothing to struggle against. Now, again, this doesn't mean that you can't see visually a three-dimensional, or what's appearing to be a three-dimensional world. The mind will still put together the practical experience of the senses so that you can navigate your environment and so forth. It's just exquisitely obvious that that's only a mental construct. It's not even whether you believe it or not. It's just, it's like a mirage, sort of. Everything I talk about from here on out is just paradoxical, really, and you just have to get comfortable with paradox here. But even though it's a mirage, it's not like there's a watcher state. It's not like there's someone standing apart from it, trying to avoid anything. It's not there's no numbness to it. You can't avoid anything now. To make distance doesn't make sense anymore. So there's no difference anymore between what's happening and what you prefer. It doesn't matter. It's just what's happening. So there is sort of a deep intimacy and an immersion and a profound involvement in life. How your life looks can vary. You may be, a monastic and spend a lot of time alone, or you may be engaged in a lot of relationship, or you may be retired, or you may be working. Those practical circumstances really aren't contingent upon this realization that I'm talking about. They're just the textures of the momentary flow of experience. So in the practical sense, or in the conventional sense, there's no way things have to look for you for what I'm talking about to be realized. It doesn't really matter what's going on outwardly in your life. You could say it this way, that before this clarifies, it's almost as if the environment and the narrative of what's happening in your life takes priority most of the time for your attention, and then you spend a little time here and there, whether it's through meditation or inquiry or mindfulness practices, or it just comes upon you where there's a touching into this unconditioned truth of reality, and then that's flipped over. All of a sudden, there's just the unconditioned all the time, really, and the textures of life are there, but they're much lighter, much more. There's just so much less buy-in. But again, you're not numb to anything. It's just things are lighter, and not a problem. There's even problems are so light, because there's just so much enjoyment in continuing to just give yourself to this unconditioned, because it really, in a sense, is the source of everything. But it's not a background. It's not a ground of being. It's not a source entity. And it's actually not apart from the textures of experience themselves. That's the other strange thing about this. So in one sense, the paradox is the conventional. The appearances are all that is left, really, because what is unconditioned has no actual outward manifestation, no texture. It's without texture. It's without location. But it's not nothingness, and I want to clarify that, because nothingness is something, and often it's conceptual. It's a conceptual something. So it's not a nothingness. I'm not talking about awareness or formlessness as a vast space or anything like that. That's the way the mind imagines this that I'm speaking about. Intimacy is the word I come up with a lot for this, but there's no great word for it. And then instead of life being divided into parts or moments or priorities, like there's the part of me that meditates, the part of me that goes on retreat, the part of me that goes to work, or even the conditions that arise in those situations. Instead of that, it's just always the unconditioned, and it can display as different textures. It can display as a meditative texture, a deep samadhi, and it can display as the texture of a fence, the texture of the taste of eggs, the texture of working. But those textures never leave the unconditioned. They're a simple and momentary expression of flavor, perhaps. There's a Zen teacher named Banki who used to say over and over, everything is perfectly managed in the unborn. I think that's pretty accurate. You know, if you feel inclined to practice, to realize the unborn, that's great, that's wonderful. But if you don't, it doesn't matter, because it's still the unborn. Everything is perfectly managed in the unborn. And the unborn is right in front of your face all the time. It just is taking the form of a thought and an overlay and an image, whatever. So you come to a place, I suppose, where you have a profound respect for the Dharma, for living truth, for the process of realization itself. And yet, no part of you can really champion being awake versus not being awake, or realization versus not realization. There's nothing to grab onto that could confirm that. So again, a paradox, but I find myself in that paradox endlessly. There really is no difference between the mundane and the divine, between samsara and nirvana. Because ultimately those are conditioned experiences. Or we wouldn't have to give them names. What I'm pointing to doesn't have a name. Doesn't need a name. It's not a state. It's not a goal. It can take any of those forms, of course, but ultimately it just hits that You've just never been apart from it in any way. Nothing has been apart from anything in any way ever, nor could it ever be. I like the sort of approach of Soto Zen, which is essentially you're already Buddha nature. You're already awake nature. So just sit there and know it. It'll dawn at some point, likely, but it doesn't matter if it does or not. Very, very simple, very simplistic, but true. And this, and the practiceless practice of Soto Zen really is shikantaza, which is what I point to when I describe natural meditation. It's not a practice, but it'll feel like a practice for a long time, or at least for me, it felt like a practice for a long time, or it felt like something I didn't quite get or wasn't quite tuning into. And sometimes I feel like I was tuning into it, and then all of a sudden it just completely clicked. All practices collapsed, and there was just that. It's already here all the time. The natural meditation. Now, that does not even preclude the possibility of a focused type of practice or inquiry. Those can still occur, of course, but it doesn't mean that natural meditation is not just here, because it is. Of course it is, because it's unconditioned. So if I had a piece of advice, which I'm not sure I do, but if I had a piece of advice, it's something like, know that you're already the unconditioned. Just know it, because it's true. And if a doubt arises about that, whether it's a cognitive doubt or whether it's an experiential doubt or a gut level doubt, that's perfectly okay, because that is also the unconditioned, and it's showing you something. It's kind of just saying, look here, look at this. And if we look closely enough in the right way, we find that doubt is just another flavor of presence. It's another flavor of the unconditioned. And there are different ways to look. There are different ways to do that, but inquiry, I would say, is a good go-to. It's a good way to do it, generally. Because inquiry is open-ended. Inquiry is horizontalizing the mast of the ego. It's saying, I don't already know. It's surrendering one's egoic frame of reference and saying, okay, my frame of reference apparently isn't working here, so what is at the root of this experience? What is this? Or who or what is perceiving the doubt? I'm looking for it, feeling into it. Or is there any need? Is there anything here that has to react to this doubt with another layer of resistance, let's say? Is there anything that actually has to react to the doubt? And just look for it. Look for anything that's not a thought. This works for anything, an emotion, a trigger point, a density, a contraction, a pain center, even a narrative. Again, we are already the unconditioned. The unborn is just this, expressing itself just as this. And if this feels like an emotion, it feels like a resistance pattern, then we can trust that that is the unconditioned. That is simply a flavor of presence, and it's here to, I want to say show us something, but it's here intelligently. Let's say that it's here to investigate. It's grace, really. It's grace, even if it's uncomfortable. And sometimes, especially if it's uncomfortable. Because ultimately the question becomes, who is it that's judging comfort from discomfort? Who is it that thinks they need to always feel comfortable and never feel uncomfortable? Who or where is that? Can I find it? Can I find the one that thinks it can stand apart from experience and pick this one or choose that one? Reject this one or reject that one? That activity seems to be going on. That's clear. But is there anyone actually pulling those levers? Can I find anyone pulling those levers? Or even anything? It's okay that the levers are being pulled. They're already, that's what's happening. That's what we're noticing. But this always comes down to identity. Getting behind the view. Getting behind the frame of reference. What's back there? Or is there a back there? Or is that just another thought? Reflecting another thought. Reflecting another thought. So anyway, these kinds of investigations are incredibly valuable. But we can always start and end with a knowing that all there really is the unconditioned. And it can arise as conditioned textures. And that's fine. They're all entry points. Everything is an entry point. In the Zendo downstairs, there's a piece of Japanese parchment, and I had a calligrapher make it. It was really a fun process. And she did the Japanese caricatures for me. Or characters. I think it ended up being kanji. It's kanji. It says, enter here. That's all it says. But that's a very valuable pointing, because the mind is complex. The mind tends to make things more complex than they are, actually. But reality is simple. Reality is very, very simple. The unconditioned is beyond simple. But whatever's being presented in this moment, enter here. Enter here with authenticity, with vulnerability, with curiosity, with heart, and you can't go wrong. It could take some time. There may be some disorientation or confusion or contraction. There will be doubt. But everything is an entry point. When we it's actually a very, very simple and very subtle, well, I don't know if it's subtle. It's a very simple act to orient oneself to truth. We've all done this already, or we wouldn't be here, for sure. But I make a lot of videos about, what are the 5 things to do to start on this process, or 3 things you can do to wake up. But I'm always pointing to the same thing, and it's just not about finding the right teacher. It's not about, finding the exactly right doctrine. It's not about the exact right practice or the perfect mantra. It's not about exerting yourself until you just can't even take it anymore. It's really not about any of those things. It's a commitment at the level of heart. It's an acknowledgement of living truth, whatever that is for you, whether it's the Dharma, God. It's acknowledgement that I am willing to orient my life to that, however that has to happen. That's it. It's very, very simple. And then just reminding yourself of that. And then feeling, how does that feel for the body to process that? How does it feel to move? How does it feel to breathe? How does it feel to emote? Knowing I'm really willing. I mean, I don't even know how to do it, but I'm willing to orient myself to truth, living truth. I'm willing to feel some discomfort because I just know it probably will come. But I may not even like it, but I'm willing to go through what I have to go through. That's what this takes, and that's what matters. And that's the acknowledgement that I'm talking about, of recognizing we are already the unconditioned. It's already just this. Nisargadatta said something, I'm going to misquote it, but he said something to the effect of, my teacher told me that I was the supreme source of all being, or something like that. And then he said, just orient to that. Just sit in that knowing. And then my teacher died. And I think he said in 3 years I was liberated. That's that kind of huge commitment that I'm talking about. Ramana Maharishi did it after his father died when he was 15. He just laid down and went through the dying process himself. Let go of everything that was conditioned. And it worked out really well for him. We don't all have to do it that way. In fact, none of us will do it in exactly those ways. We do it in our own way. And that's the beauty of this too. This is so radically impersonal. This whole thing is so funny because it is really impersonal in so many ways. And yet it feels so personal a lot of the time. But you do, in a sense, find your own way in, because the textures of you and who you are and your experiences and your heart and your mind are unique in the relative world. So your story doesn't have to look like my story or Nisargadatta's story or Buddha's story. That's, again, trusting that intuition, the intuition that goes beyond your thoughts, your beliefs, even beyond your physical body. And yet, it's still there. It's still right here. That is the unconditioned.